Hello guys, welcome to Hidden Timelines. Tonight we are not merely recounting the dry facts of a boy who wore a crown too soon, we are stepping into the candlelit chambers of Tudor England, where a child's breath carried the weight of a kingdom and where a nation's salvation was bound up in the fragile body of a single infant. It begins in 1537. Henry VIII had fought, schemed and prayed for years to secure one thing above all, a son. His marriages had left him with daughters and disappointment, and the kingdom lived under the shadow of instability. Then at last the miracle. Jane Seymour, his third queen, delivered a boy. The bells rang, bonfires roared across villages, sermons thundered from pulpits. England had a Prince Edward. A fragile bundle of swaddling cloths became the most celebrated child in the land. Yet joy quickly soured. Just 12 days later, Jane Seymour was dead, carried off by childbed fever. The cost of Henry's dynastic dream was the life of the only woman he is said to have truly loved. This dual birth of a son and of a widowhood defined Edward's earliest existence. From the first weeks he was both adored and pitied. His father, guilty and exultant in equal measure, treated him not as a child but as a symbol. Every movement of the baby was watched, recorded, and interpreted as an omen for England's future. While Mary and Elizabeth, his half-sisters, bore the scars of rejection and legitimacy disputes, Edward knew only exultation. He was not merely loved, he was revered a little god in the nursery. Henry VIII, wary of plots and deeply conscious of the fragile Tudor claim to the throne, lavished his heir with a world designed not for play, but for preparation. The best tutors were summoned. This was no ordinary education, it was an ideological forge. The boy would be taught Latin and Greek, yes, but also polemical theology, the kind that thundered against Rome and painted Catholicism as corruption. Henry intended his heir not only to rule, but to embody the Protestant destiny of England. John Check, his chief tutor, was more than a scholar, he was a zealot. Check and his circle believed England was chosen by God to be a New Jerusalem cleansed of superstition and papal chains. Into Edward's young mind they poured not fairy tales or gentle stories, but fierce visions of holy war purity and divine right. He learned to reason like a theologian before he learned to ride a horse. At 8 years old he could argue with chilling fluency why Catholic heretics deserved execution. He debated with scholars as if he were already a man, and he was praised for it. But in that very praise lay the seed of something dangerous, a child stripped of innocence, denied companionship and taught that disagreement with him was not only political disloyalty, but defiance of God himself. Edward's early chambers reflected this strange upbringing. Instead of toys, he kept theological treatises. Instead of laughter with other children, he had endless disputations with adults who bowed before him. Courtiers whispered that the prince could quote scripture fluently, but had never played a game of chess in his life. He was raised to be brilliant, yes, but brilliance without empathy, intellect without warmth, a boy whose mind sharpened even as his heart withered in solitude. This fusion, the sharpness of intellect and the absence of ordinary human feeling, was the crucible in which England's boy king was formed. The child who should have been chasing butterflies in the gardens of Hampton Court instead studied the best ways to purge a realm of error. By the autumn of 1547, when Henry VIII died, and a 9-year-old was led to the throne, Edward was not merely a boy inheriting a crown. He was a zealot in miniature, a child who believed himself divinely chosen, stepping into a kingdom already fractured by faith and awaiting the hand that would either heal or shatter it. And from the very beginning, those who served him realized the boy did not intend to be a puppet. He intended to reign. Before we continue, if this tale keeps you company tonight, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from and what hour has the night brought you on? The boy's world was lined not with toys, but with texts. Edward's tutors designed a childhood where every lesson was a step toward destiny, every page a tool to sharpen the crown he would one day wear. Latin and Greek formed the skeleton of his education, the bones of rhetoric and classical philosophy. But layered over those bones was muscle and sinew made of theology. At 6 years old, Edward was already reading the works of Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, and the fiery polemics of English reformers who had fled to the continent and returned with sharper convictions than when they left. John Checky, his chief tutor, drilled him relentlessly, insisting that true kingship was not only about ruling men, but about ruling their consciences. The boy translated passages of scripture until he knew them by heart, not as comfort, but as weapon. Each verse became a brick in a wall of certainty that Protestants were chosen and Catholics condemned. If Edward faltered, it was not with affection that Check corrected him, but with solemn warnings. To err in grammar was forgivable, but to err in doctrine could endanger a soul. Around Edward clustered not just tutors, but preachers and polemicists, men who carried the fervour of Geneva and Wittenberg into the chambers of Hampton Court. Hugh Latimer, the fiery bishop, thundered sermons before the child that left courtiers pale. Nicholas Ridley, another rising reformer, pressed the notion that the monarch was God's vicegerent, wielding authority over both state and church. These were not neutral lessons, they were carefully constructed scaffolds of ideology hammered into place while the boy was still small enough to be moulded. Even Edward's practice exercises betrayed the agenda. Where another prince might translate a fable or pen a harmless letter, Edward was set to compose arguments on why papal authority was blasphemy, or why heretics deserved burning. By 8, he could frame syllogisms equating disobedience to his future rule with disobedience to God himself. His essays read like miniature sermons, more denunciation than reflection. Outside his chamber, London was alive with the arguments of the Reformation. Pulpits rang with rival preachers, some urging moderation, others promising that only fire and purity could secure England's soul. The young prince absorbed it all. Second-hand, his tutors filtering the noise, giving him only the voices that reinforced his destiny. He did not hear the lullabies of mothers in market squares, or the laughter of apprentices at play. He heard proclamations, disputations, the solemn cadences of men who believed England's fate rested on his thin shoulders. The result was a paradox. Edward grew precociously clever but emotionally barren. He could pass Aristotle, yet had never shared secrets with a friend. He could argue why martyrs must die, but had never seen a companion scrape a knee. Courtiers sometimes marvelled at his quickness, but their marvel was tinged with unease. Cleverness without contact, a mind sharpened to a razor, but a heart left unshaped, became his default state. Ink-stained fingers pale from long hours indoors marked his progress. He filled pages with notes and commentaries recording not feelings but judgments. Even the smallest victories, completing a passage, mastering a verse, were rewarded not with embraces, but with solemn approval. Affection was absent, praise was conditional. He learned early that love came not as warmth, but as reverence measured by how well he defended Protestant truth. By the time he was 9, Edward was not a child who played with wooden swords. He was a boy rehearsing the wars of faith with words sharper than steel, and soon those words would be given the power of law. Edward's world was ordered precise and unbearably quiet. While other children discovered themselves through play, his universe was lined with ink and parchment. He did not chase in gardens or invent games in shadowed corners. Instead, he filled notebooks with spare clinical entries. His journals still preserved read not like the musings of a boy, but like the ledgers of a clerk. When his uncle Somerset was executed, Edward did not record sorrow. He wrote only, "The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off upon Tower Hill," as if the end of a man's life were no different from noting the day's weather. This cold grammar of power became his refuge. The diary was a place not of emotion, but of inventory, executions, sermons, punishments, political decisions, all described in the same flat cadence. Where another child might have painted in his feelings in clumsy sketches, Edward kept lists, names, charges, judgments. He was learning to see human beings as proposition problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed. The child who could argue with a scholar now rehearsed rulership by tallying lives. Isolation amplified this habit. There were no brothers or playmates to soften him, only adults who bowed and deferred. Their reverence created distance. Every smile was rehearsed, every word measured, and Edward, sensing this, retreated deeper into the only relationship that never faltered ink on paper. When courtiers laughed, it was to flatter. When tutors praised, it was to shape. But the parchment neither deceived nor demanded. It absorbed everything with the same silence. Even the rhythm of his daily life underscored this detachment. Mornings with scripture, afternoons with disputations, evenings with lessons on governance. Every hour filled, every instance weighted. Music, poetry, and stories that might have stirred empathy were stripped away in favour of lessons on obedience and purity. Where his sisters Mary and Elizabeth at least tasted the sharp edges of their father's temper and the fickleness of court favour, Edward was mothered in consistency, constant praise, constant certainty. Ironically, it left him brittle. What began as a child's diary became a template for rule. If an execution could be reduced to a line in a notebook, why should mercy weigh more than ink? If rebellion was only an entry in the day's tally, then the cost of bloodshed was merely arithmetic. In this sterile accounting, Edward was rehearsing for government long before he ever sat in council. The boy who learned to argue had learned also to command and to command without pity. January 1547. The bells tolled muffled by frost, and the courtiers moved in silence through the great halls of Whitehall. Henry VIII, the lion who had torn England from Rome, was dead. His coffin bound in cloth of gold left behind a kingdom both transformed and fractured. And into this vacuum stepped a boy of 9. Edward, pale, studious, untested, yet already convinced he was God's chosen. The coronation was a spectacle of pageantry, but beneath the glitter ran unease. Chroniclers record the child king dressed in robes too heavy for his thin frame, the crown pressing low upon his brow, his solemn face betraying no joy. To the people he was the long-awaited son of prophecy, proof that the Tudors were secure. To those who sat nearest the throne he was something stranger, a child already speaking with the vocabulary of judgment, whose learning made him precocious, but whose lack of childhood left him brittle. Because Edward did not rule alone, a regency council was formed to govern in his name, headed by his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. In theory, Somerset would balance the kingdom's factions, Protestants eager for reform, Catholics clinging to the old faith, nobles hungry for power. In practice, the boy king was no passive ornament. Within weeks of his father's death, Edward attended council sessions and shocked men thrice his age. When bishops debated the pace of reform, he interrupted with precise theological arguments, quoting scripture as if from a pulpit. Eyewitnesses describe a strange scene, seasoned statesmen, hardened by wars and intrigues, pausing in embarrassment as a child corrected their doctrine. What might have been dismissed as a youthful enthusiasm quickly revealed itself as something more disturbing. Edward did not argue to learn, he argued to assert. He spoke not as a pupil, but as a judge. Each interruption carried the tone of certainty, the cadence of a sermon, the sharpness of a verdict. The council chamber, lined with tapestries and warmed by braziers, grew colder in spirit as men realized they were not shaping a pliable air. They were listening to a boy who believed himself the voice of heaven. When compromise was suggested, Edward's brow furrowed and his hand clutched the arm of his chair with an intensity out of place on a child's face. Even his silences unnerved them. For though Somerset managed the realm's armies and coined, and it was clear that Edward intended to manage its soul, England at this moment was a tinderbox. The Church of England existed, yes, but barely a decade old, and loyalties were divided. Catholic priests whispered mass in secret, parishioners clung to images and Latin prayers, reformers demanded purity beyond even Henry's break with Rome. Into this fragile landscape the boy king brought not patience but fire. The court began to whisper, was this prodigy a blessing or a zealot cloaked in velvet? The crown on his brow was heavy, but it seemed to weigh not at all. For Edward did not feel its burden, he felt its authority. If you're still journeying with me, write the number 1 in the comments, so I know the story still has you. The crown had barely settled on Edward's brow before the first cuts were made. Statutes rolled from the council chamber like chisels against stone, each one reshaping England's sacred landscape. Images were ordered torn from churches. Walls that for centuries had carried painted saints were scraped bare, their colours fading under whitewash. Stone saints once kissed by parishioners were toppled, their broken faces carted away in silence. But the most striking measure was the attack on chantries, those small and endowed chapels where priests prayed daily for the souls of the dead. To Edward's teachers, these were monuments of superstition, proof of a corrupt Catholic obsession with purgatory. Yet to ordinary villagers they were lifelines. A chantry priest was often the only schoolmaster, the only one who could read the letters of a labourer's son or mark a will for a widow. When the laws dissolved these institutions, it was not merely ritual that vanished, but education arms and community ties. The boy king, however, saw none of that. To him, each confiscation was a cleansing, a victory for God's truth. In council, when reports came of resistance, Edward's eyes brightened rather than dimmed. Obstinacy confirmed his mission. His journal entries record not hesitation but satisfaction, as though each broken altar brought England closer to heaven. Behind the rhetoric of purity lay another motive coin. The dissolution of chantries filled the royal treasury at a time when Henry VIII's wars had drained it dry. The golden land stripped from these little chapels were parcelled out to courtiers, enriching the very men who sat at Edward's side. Finance and faith intertwined turned piety into profit. The boy might dream of Jerusalem, but his ministers eyed the rents and revenues flowing from confiscated lands. In parish after parish, the changes struck like thunder. The sound of Latin masses gave way to the rough cadence of English prayers. Candlelight no longer flickered before statues of Mary or the saints. Children who once learned their letters under a chantry priest now stood idle. For villagers, the world seemed to come unstitched. For Edward, it was proof that England was finally shaking off Rome's chains. This was purity by statute, enforced by proclamation and carried out with hammer and blade, and the boy king, still barely 10, assented eagerly to each new measure. To question these reforms was to question not only the monarch, but the God he believed spoke through him. The first wave of Edward's rule left scars on stone and souls alike. England's churches became plainer, poorer, colder. And for the boy on the throne, this was not loss but triumph. He believed he was building a new Jerusalem. What he was truly building was a kingdom more fractured, more embittered, and more fragile than ever before. Justice in Tudor England was never quiet. It was a theatre of power staged in open air, designed to terrify as much as to correct. Proclamations were read in marketplaces, oaths sworn upon holy books, judgments pronounced beneath painted coats of arms. At the scaffold, the condemned were made to speak their guilt aloud before the axe fell, their voices echoing over crowds that gathered not to mourn but to learn. Punishment was spectacle, and the crown was the playwright. Into this theatre stepped a boy. Edward, not yet 10, discovered quickly that his pen was sharper than any sword. When writs of execution or warrants of punishment were laid before him, he examined them with unnerving seriousness. Courtiers who expected hesitation saw instead a child leaning forward with quill in hand, weighing theological arguments as if the lives of strangers were lines in a school debate. And when he finally pressed ink to parchment, the act seemed to give him satisfaction. Chroniclers whispered of his calmness. A man might tremble as he awaited judgment, but Edward, small and pale, would sign with the stillness of one noting down a lesson. He had been trained to believe that heresy was not opinion, but rebellion against God. To sign a death warrant was in his mind not cruelty but obedience. Where others might blanch at the consequence, Edward felt he was merely setting heaven's law in motion. The pageantry of justice seemed to fascinate him. Reports describe the boy king asking for details of executions afterward, how the condemned had stood, whether they recited prayers, how clean the axe had fallen. He recorded such accounts with the same detached precision he used to note weather or royal revenues. For him, suffering became observation, and observation became knowledge. In Tudor England, every sentence was ritual, the reading of charges, the call for God's judgment, the prayers of the doomed. Edward absorbed these ceremonies like a catechism, learning that governance was less about mercy than about performance. His role was to ensure the play unfolded as written. The condemned provided the lines, he provided the authority. To be the boy who signed was to wield a power grotesquely disproportionate to his years. Each flourish of his quill transformed doctrine into destiny for men and women he would never meet. The parchment carried their fate from palace chamber to scaffold, where axe and rope completed the script. In that chain of command, quill, parchment, proclamation, scaffold, Edward found a rhythm that felt natural. Others saw cruelty, he saw order, and England, fractured and fearful, was learning what it meant to live under the judgments of a child who had never learned to play, but who had learned all too well how to command. While Edward sat in chambers plotting purity beyond palace walls, the villages of England shivered through winters of hunger and unrest. Religious decrees may have dominated council papers, but for ordinary men and women, faith was only half the burden. The other half was bread. Henry VIII had left behind not only a divided church but a ruined treasury. To finance wars in France and Scotland, he had debased the coinage flooding the realm with silver coins cut with base metals. Prices rose like tidewater faster than wages could follow. What had once bought a loaf now bought only a crust. Edward inherited this poisoned economy, and though he grasped theology with brilliance, he barely noticed the arithmetic of desperation multiplying in his villages. In the countryside, enclosures spread landlords fencing off common fields to turn pasture into profit. Where peasants once grazed a cow or cut wood hedges and ditches now shut them out. Families trudged hungry to parish priests asking where charity had gone. But the chantries were gone, their priests dismissed their alms, dissolved into royal coffers. The safety nets of medieval piety had been torn away at the very moment people most needed them. The boy king's proclamations thundered about purity of worship, but in the cottages of Devon and Norfolk the arguments of bishops mattered little beside the empty pot on the fire. Mothers whispered to children that the world was changing too quickly, saints vanishing from churches, neighbours driven from fields coin that felt lighter in the hand even as it bought less at the market. To them the Reformation was not a grand project of heaven, It was hunger on a Thursday night, it was the shame of selling a pot to buy beer bread, it was the quiet terror of debts that could not be paid. Yet Edward, isolated in his chambers, believed he was building paradise. He saw the stripping of altars as progress, not theft, the seizure of chantry lands as godly cleansing, not economic theft. His pen ordered changes whose consequences he would never taste. For the people who trudged home from markets empty-handed, reform felt less like salvation and more like betrayal. This was the tinderbox beneath the pews, a kingdom restless, not only in spirit, but in stomach. The boy king demanded purity. His subjects, weary and embittered, demanded something simpler, bread pasture, and the old certainties that once bound community together. England was a land stretched taut between pulpit and plough, and when taut cords snap, they do not break quietly. The year 1549 tore England open. The boy who signed decrees from London suddenly ruled a country that no longer obeyed in silence. From the far west to the fields of Norfolk, the weight of reform collided with hunger, and rebellion roared. In Devon and Cornwall it began with words spoken in a tongue most parishioners did not even understand. The new Book of Common Prayer, written in English, was forced upon congregations who had prayed for generations in Latin. To scholars in London this was liberation. To villagers who had whispered old phrases since birth, it felt like robbery. They demanded their Latin masses back, their saints, restored, their world of familiar ritual returned. But the government branded their cries as sedition heresy cloaked in nostalgia. Thus the prayer book rebellion began, peasants and priests marching together, banners painted with the 5 wounds of Christ chanting that they would rather die than see their souls starved. Across the country in Norfolk, another grievance flared land. Enclosures crept like thorns across the commons' hedges, rising where neighbours once grazed cattle side by side. Anger boiled over, and under the leadership of Robert Kett, villagers tore down the hedges and built their own camp on Mousehold Heath. Thousands gathered, not with cries against doctrines, but against lordship that stole their fields. They demanded fair rents and end to greedy landlords and justice from a government that had forgotten them. 2 rebellions, 2 languages, one of prayer, one of plough. Both, however, were met with the same response. Somerset, Edward's uncle and protector, sent armies. Foreign mercenaries marched through Devon lanes. Cannon fire echoed across Norfolk fields. The suppression was merciless. At Clyst Heath, rebels were slaughtered by the thousands, their bodies left piled in silence. In Norwich, Kett's men were cut down, and Kett himself was dragged to the Tower and hanged from the very walls that had once shielded him. From the boy king's viewpoint, these uprisings were proof that England needed more, not less, discipline. His journals note them not with pity, but with certainty. Rebellion was sin, and sin required punishment. To Edward, the deaths were not tragedy, but necessity, the kingdom pruned of diseased branches. Yet for England, the year of rebellion left scars. In the west villages grieved priests and farmers alike. In Norfolk, fields stood silent where hedges had been ripped down and rebuilt in blood. Faith and land had been defended and lost, and the promise of a new Jerusalem seemed further away than ever. Edward's project survived, but the realm staggered beneath the weight of its survival. For beneath the boy's absolutes, the kingdom was no longer one voice, but many crying in Latin, in English, in hunger, in rage. And those voices, though silenced in 1549, would not be gone forever. The rebellions of 1549 did not just break villages, they broke the protector. Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, had been the boy king's uncle guardian and the realm's self-proclaimed good duke. He preached moderation, hesitated to crush too harshly, and cloaked his policies in paternal care. But in the wake of Devon's massacres and Norfolk's executions, Somerset's reputation curdled. The good duke began to look like a weak one. The nobility circled. At court, whispers carried sharper edges than swords. Somerset had made enemies too lenient with rebels, too arrogant with peers, too slow to share the spoils of confiscated lands. And in the shifting frost of Tudor politics, missteps were fatal. By autumn, he was surrounded. John Dudley. Earl of Warwick sensed his moment. With a mixture of calculation and quiet menace, Dudley turned his counsellors against the Protector. In October 1549, the coup was swift. Somerset was seized, led from Hampton Court, and confined in the Tower. The child king recorded it in his diary with the same barren precision he had used for executions, a single line as if noting a change in the weather. Yet those who watched him remarked that Edward did not seem shaken. If anything, he looked newly alert, as though freed from a tether, for the boy was no puppet. While Somerset had sometimes held him back with moderation, Dudley, soon to be Duke of Northumberland, offered something closer to what Edward himself wanted: a sharper Protestant line discipline, without apology, purity without compromise. In Dudley's ascent, calculation replaced crusade, but the result was the same. England pressed further along the road of reform. The temperature of the court changed. Under Somerset there had been sermons and visions of a godly commonwealth, half ideal, half naive. Under Dudley there was order. Ledgers balanced rebellions strangled in silence, and the boy king found himself paired with a steward who knew how to wield power with a colder hand. Edward, far from recoiling, relished it. His confidence grew in Dudley's shadow. He now spoke in council not as the prodigy corrected, but as the ruler affirmed. His zeal sharpened into policy, his pen into law. The uncle had fallen, but the nephew, already schooled in absolutes, seemed only more resolved. In the shifting game of Tudor factions, one truth became clear: Edward was learning to survive changes of men. What did not change was his conviction. With Dudley at his side, the boy's dream of a purified England burned fiercer still. By 1552, the kingdom's worship had been rewritten in ink as well as stone. The first Book of Common Prayer of 1549 had unsettled villages, but the second, issued under Edward's sharpened Protestant will, was more radical still. The language grew starker, stripped of any phrasing that hinted at Catholic belief. Altars were ordered torn down and replaced by wooden communion tables, dragged into the nave like furniture in a house rather than shrines in a temple. Vestments once rich with embroidery were banished for the plainer robes of a minister. The sacraments became symbols rather than mysteries. To Edward, these were victory's steps towards the England his tutors had promised, a nation cleansed of superstition, purified by scripture alone. In his journals he noted changes without hesitation, recording them as achievements the way another boy might list chess moves or victories in a game. Each alteration felt to him like another stone laid in the walls of a holy city. But to parishes the changes were brutal interruptions. Altars that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Parishioners who had gathered in awe before candles and saints found bare walls, instead their churches hollowed of colour, emptied of meaning. The sacred landscape of England was being erased by decree, and each village was forced to accept it or face scrutiny. For these reforms were not left to chance. Commissioners rode into towns, conducting visitations, peering into parish chests, demanding evidence of conformity. Clergy were ordered to preach against papist practices, their sermons monitored by informers. Neighbours watched one another closely, reporting if Latin prayers were whispered or if a crucifix lingered in a private room. Conformity became less a matter of belief than of survival. To deviate was to risk fines, imprisonment, or worse. The competitor's portrait of Edward's surveillance state is chilling, and it was true that the young king's council encouraged denunciation, rewarding those who exposed superstition. But in practice, the machinery of enforcement was uneven. Tudor government was powerful in symbols weak in reach. A royal proclamation might be thundered from London, yet its echo in a Devon parish depended on the zeal of a local magistrate or the silence of a village unwilling to betray its own. Even so, the fear was real. People learned to live double lives, obedient in public, traditional in the private. Edward, however, believed his vision was working. The reports reaching his council spoke of stripped churches and sermons preached in English. He read them as triumphs, not realizing that beneath the surface many hearts remained unchanged. To him, conformity on paper equaled conversion of soul, and each visitor's report confirmed his conviction that England was on the path to becoming God's new Jerusalem. The 1552 prayer book was not merely liturgy, it was architecture, a framework of belief designed to reorder a kingdom. Communion tables, plain robes, bare walls, these were not accidents of style but deliberate statements, signs of a faith stripped to bone. And though parishioners whispered their discontent, the boy king saw only victory. His England was becoming plainer, harsher, and in his eyes purer. For most children, sisters are companions, sometimes rivals, always bound by shared memories. For Edward, they were instruments, tools in the struggle for England's soul. His gaze fell first on Mary, the elder sister, whose faith made her dangerous. A devout Catholic, she refused to abandon the old Mass, and in her defiance Edward saw not family but treason. At court, her conscience was debated as if it were a diplomatic crisis, which in truth it was, for Mary's refusal drew the attention of her powerful cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who happened also to be her nephew by blood. Ambassadors whispered threats if the king's council pressed her too hard, Spanish steel might cross the channel. To Edward, this was intolerable. How could the destiny of Protestant England be jeopardized by one woman clinging to Latin prayers, so laws were sharpened? Statutes forbade the old rites. Proclamations threatened punishment for those who resisted. The council hoped Mary would bend. She did not. In private letters, she wrote that her faith was not hers to change, that it bound her more tightly than any royal decree. Edward seethed. He referred to her not as sister, but as enemy of Christ, even dreaming of ways to have her branded illegitimate once more. The boy who should have felt fraternal affection instead plotted her ruin. Elizabeth, by contrast, seemed more useful. Her Protestant leanings placed her on the safer side of his theology, and Edward treated her less as kin than as a strategic piece on a European chessboard. He imagined her marriage as a tool to secure alliances, her body a dowry for his Protestant future. What happiness she might desire, what affection she might hold, these never entered his calculations. To Edward, Elizabeth was valuable precisely because she could be traded. In the letters and council records of this period, family disappears into policy. Mary becomes a problem to be solved, Elizabeth an asset to be leveraged. Blood no longer signifies love, but the battlefield on which conviction and politics collide. And at the centre sits Edward, a boy who had never learned to play, but who had learned to command, treating even his sisters as subjects in his relentless vision of a purified realm. In Edward's England, discipline was never hidden, it was staged. The court understood that words could instruct, but spectacle could transform. Sermons thundered from pulpits not as gentle reflections, but as broadcasts of state policy, each preacher's cadence echoing the king's will. From cathedral choirs down to parish pulpits, the message was drilled: Papist rites were treason, heresy, deserved fire, and obedience was holiness. Every Sunday became a lesson in loyalty, every congregation a captive audience to the boy king's convictions. Beyond the pulpit lay the scaffold. Executions were never private affairs. They were classrooms in which the body of the condemned became a blackboard for royal authority. The condemned were forced to confess to praise the justice of the crown and to beg the people to learn from their fate. Blood on the block was meant to be not horror, but instruction. And Edward, reading reports of these rituals, took fascination in the details, the words spoken, the steadiness of the prisoner, the effect on the crowd. For him, suffering was not tragedy, it was data. Processions, too, became instruments of pedagogy. The king's body was seldom seen, but when it appeared in public on a litter, through London streets in ceremonies at Westminster, it spoke louder than any decree. Velvet banners and trumpets told a story: this child was God's anointed, and to disobey him was to disobey heaven itself. Even sportance was scripted. Crowds stood in hushed awe, sensing the careful orchestration of power in motion. Edward delighted in the punishments that humiliated as much as they hurt. A page who spilled wine was pelted with refuse under the king's gaze. A priest who clung to Latin was paraded with placards denouncing him as Christ's enemy. These cruelties were not slips of temper, but acts of theatre staged to teach lessons about obedience. Fear, after all, instructs more quickly than debate. In this world of performance, the boy who had never been allowed tenderness fashioned a pedagogy of severity. Mercy was weakness, pity error. The kingdom became a stage upon which obedience was drilled through human scaffold and spectacle. And Edward, though only a boy, played the role of director with unnerving conviction, as if cruelty itself were a form of governance. By the spring of 1553, the boy who had once been hailed as England's salvation was visibly dying. Courtiers who had seen him as a pale but precocious child now whispered of hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, and a cough that tore through his slender chest. Physicians argued over causes. Some spoke of consumption, what we would call tuberculosis, a wasting disease that carried away countless Tudor bodies. Others suspected complications from measles or smallpox, lingering infections that had weakened him beyond repair. Later generations even whispered of poisoning, perhaps accidental, as desperate doctors dosed him with arsenic-laced tonics in their frantic search for a cure. What was certain was the spectacle of decline. The once boyish figure grew gaunt. His skin stretched over bone, his body emitting a sour odour that made even attendants flinch. His hair thinned, his nails blackened. Yet even as his body collapsed, his mind seemed to blaze with greater ferocity. Pain did not soften Edward. It clarified him. Each coughing fit, each fevered night seemed to drive him deeper into his conviction that God had chosen him for a task only death could interrupt. Attendants hoped suffering might stir gentleness. Instead, it stripped away hesitation. Propped up on pillows, the boy delivered rambling sermons, insisting that England must be purged still further of Catholic taint. Some dismissed them as delirium, but when fever lifted, he repeated the same demands with calm precision. He told his council that compromise was betrayal, that to permit even a whisper of Latin Mass was to defy heaven. The sick room became a second council chamber. Sheets reeked of sweat, basins of bloodied sputum crowded the corners, yet advisers were summoned to listen as the king dictated visions of a Protestant future that stretched far beyond his own waning strength. He spoke of laws yet to be written, punishments yet to be inflicted, reforms yet to be carved into the life of every parish. Death, he believed, could not be allowed to undo what he had begun. In another child, illness might have brought humility. In Edward, it seemed to ignite the last reserves of iron. He became more certain as his body became less. To watch him in these months was to witness a paradox, a youth wasting away yet speaking as though eternity burned through his frail frame. England waited, half hoping, half dreading, to see whether the king's flesh or his will would outlast the other. As Edward's body wasted, his mind turned to the future. He knew his time was short, yet his greatest fear was not death itself. It was Mary, the elder sister who clung to Latin Mass, who bowed to Rome, who prayed before saints and candles if she inherited everything he had built would be undone. The altars stripped, the books rewritten, the kingdom wrenched back into the arms of Catholicism. For Edward, this was unthinkable, so he began to write. In shaky script, he drafted what he called a devise for the succession. It was an audacious document. The crown by law should pass to Mary and then Elizabeth. Edward intended to cut them both out. In their place, he named his cousin Lady Jane Grey, a girl of just 16 as rigorously Protestant as he raised in the same hard school of scripture and stern tutors. The legal acrobatics were astonishing. To displace two legitimate daughters of Henry VIII required twisting statutes and ignoring precedents. But Edward pressed on, summoning judges, councillors and lawyers demanding their signatures. Some balked, pointing out the illegality. Yet hesitation in the face of a king, even a dying one, was dangerous. To refuse was treason, to comply was perjury, so pens were dipped, oaths were sworn, consciences were bent. Northumberland, the newly powerful John Dudley, pushed hardest. Jane was his ward, married to his son. Her rise would secure his family's future. Behind the sickroom curtains, ambition and piety braided together each stroke of Edward's pen, tightening Dudley's grip. The boy king's fevered will met the duke's cold calculation, and together they forged a document meant to reshape the destiny of England. The council chamber filled with unease. Some signed with trembling hands, praying forgiveness in private. Others rationalized, telling themselves it was temporary, that God required obedience above legality. Yet all understood the stakes. The moment Mary was displaced, England's succession, and with it its stability, rested on a paper drawn by a dying boy. Edward recorded his satisfaction. In his eyes, he had saved England once more, even as his body failed. Mary would not reign. Elizabeth too was set aside. The future in his vision belonged to Jane, a girl as pale and pious as himself, a Protestant heir who would continue his unfinished work. But in choosing to write his sisters out of history, Edward wrote England into crisis. The boy who had once been paraded in cloth of gold now lay wrapped in sweat-damp linen. His voice came in gasps, his body wasted almost beyond recognition. Yet in those final weeks, Edward clung to the one power still his, the pen. Courtiers describe his chambers filled with parchment drafts scattered across tables and floors, corners dusted with sand used to dry ink before it blurred. Each sheet bore the scratch of his weakening hand, words, uneven letters trembling, but intent unbroken. Where others in his condition might have prayed or prepared their souls, Edward wrote. He drafted proclamations, plotted succession, compiled lists of men to be rewarded and Catholics to be punished. His illness had not tamed his will, it had distilled it. Marginal notes show his restless mind. Here he amended a law to make penalties harsher. There he underlined the names of families to be disinherited. One page bore what seemed like a sermon, half theological reflection, half command. England must never return to the old idolatry. Even as fever blurred his sight, he dictated to secretaries insisting they record plans for a Protestant future that his body could not live to see. Whispered counsels gathered at his bedside. Northumberland bent low to hear him, Jane Grey's name surfacing again and again. Other councillors hovered uneasily nodding, as the boy issued instructions with the authority of one who believed his words could outlast flesh. They knew his breath was short, but they also knew to disagree was peril, so they listened, took notes and signed. The room itself became a monument of contradiction. A frail child coughing into linen, yet speaking with the tones of a prophet. the air thick with sickness yet filled with the scratch of quills, as if law itself could hold death at bay. Each page he signed was an attempt to chain the future to bind England with ink long after his hand was still. He could not conquer time, but he tried to command it line by trembling line until the very end. On the evening of July the 6th, 1553, silence fell upon the palace. The boy who had ruled with a pen sharper than any sword gasped his last. Attendants described the stench of sickness, the skin stretched taut over bone, the greenish pallor of a body poisoned by disease and by the remedies meant to save it. His final words were not of family or forgiveness, but of unfinished work, a plea that his Protestant project endure after him. Then the chamber grew still, save for the muffled sobs of servants who wept more for duty than for grief. Among the councillors who filed out of that room there was no triumph, only a strange mixture of relief and dread. The relentless boy king was gone, yet in his absence all the intricate machinery he had built, the drafts, the blueprints, the succession he had devised with shaking hand began to unravel. For the force that had bound it together was not parchment or statute, but Edward's own will. And now that will was extinguished. Within days, Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. Trumpets sounded, proclamations were read in the streets, banners were raised. But the applause was thin. Jane was known to few beyond the court, and her name carried none of the weight of Henry's bloodline. Ordinary people still nursing grievances of bread and fields looked on in silence. The machinery creaked, but it did not move. Meanwhile, Mary moved swiftly and decisively. She wrote letters calling men to her cause, rode out with a small retinue that swelled into an army and invoked not zeal, but law. She was her father's daughter, Henry's legitimate child, and the kingdom recognised the difference. What Edward had tried to erase with ink, Mary restored with the simple weight of legitimacy. As Jane sat in the tower, bewildered and pale support for her melted away. Nobles who had signed Edward's devise quietly drifted toward Mary, calculating survival. Merchants pledged her loyalty, villages cheered her name. The very council that had sworn to uphold Edward's will turned coat within days, their fear of Mary's retribution outweighed by the certainty of her claim. The scheme crafted in fever and sustained by terror collapsed almost overnight. Edward's dream of a Protestant succession died with him. Mary armed with bloodline law and the wind of legitimacy swept it aside. The boy king had tried to command the future from his deathbed. The kingdom reminded him too late that parchment alone cannot chain history. History closed Edward's book at 15, yet it is worth pausing to ask what if the pages had kept turning? What if the boy who signed with such icy certainty had lived into manhood? The outlines of that future can be traced in the fragments he left behind. His journals, fevered drafts, and proclamations reveal a vision of England stripped bare, a kingdom where altars never returned, where every parish was monitored by informers, where mercy itself was branded weakness. Had he lived, the makeshift surveillance system he sketched might have hardened into permanence a network of religious police enforcing not only outward worship but private thought. Executions which he already tallied with the scholars' detachment could have multiplied. Catholic nobles would likely have been purged, their estates seized to enrich a loyal Protestant elite. Elizabeth, had she lived under his reign, would have been bound in dynastic chains, married off to secure Protestant alliances, and Mary, if she had survived his wrath, would almost certainly have been eliminated, whether by scaffold or exile. The Church itself might have become colder, leaner, more austere than even under later Puritans. Edward showed no taste for compromise, no tolerance for ambiguity. His England could have resembled Geneva under Calvin, stripped of images, stripped of music, stripped even of joy. A state not merely Protestant, but a citadel of doctrinal purity governed as much by fear as by faith. And yet history resists pure speculation. Tudor England was never a blank canvas. Finances were in ruin, rebellions had scarred the land, noble factions remained fractious, and foreign powers watched closely. France and the Empire both held interests in English stability. Too much zealotry might have drawn invasion. Even a grown Edward, brilliant though he was, would have needed to contend with coin soldiers and councillors unwilling to bleed endlessly for ideology. Reality might have forced some softening or at least slowed his pace. Still, the prospect is chilling. For unlike his father, Edward lacked even flashes of human appetite to temper cruelty. Henry VIII could be swayed by love, by desire, by vanity. Edward knew only conviction. In that conviction lay the possibility of a tyranny colder and more relentless than England had yet endured. We did not live in that England. The boy's body broke before his will could fully harden. Yet the shadow of what might have been reminds us how narrow the path of history truly is. Sometimes survival rests not on battles won, but on the frailty of a single body. What then do we make of Edward VI? Was he a child psychopath delighting in cruelty? Or was he the inevitable product of a hot age, a boy chilled by doctrines too heavy for his years turned into an instrument of forces greater than himself? The evidence is thin but sharp. We have his journal's spare lines written in his own hand where executions and weather receive equal weight. We have council papers noting his interruptions, his insistence on severity. We have ambassador letters astounded at a youth who debated theology like a cleric and dismissed compromise like a tyrant. And we have the chronicles of rebels, priests and villagers who bore the consequences of his decrees. Together they form a ledger cold, exact, detached. Yet a ledger is not a soul. It tells us what he recorded, not what he felt. Historians argue, did Edward truly relish cruelty, or did he simply lack the tools of empathy raised in solitude? Deprived of play, praised only for zeal, was he a monster born or a child moulded into severity by tutors who saw in him a blank tablet upon which to write England's destiny? Perhaps the truth lies in the mirror he holds up to his age. The 16th century was not gentle. Across Europe, Catholics burned Protestants, Protestants burned Catholics, and rulers everywhere governed by fear. Edward, precocious and isolated, became a pure expression of that climate. A child given absolute power, trained to see mercy as weakness, faith as law, and disobedience as sin. His death at 15 spared England from the full weight of his vision. It spared his sisters from the scaffold, his people from a surveillance state that might have hardened into permanence. His life remains a caution not simply about the corruption of absolute power, but about the dangers of raising a child to be less a person than a symbol. In the end, Edward's reign is both ledger and mirror. A ledger of statutes, deaths and reforms carried out with chilling precision. A mirror of a nation that demanded salvation through fire and entrusted that demand to a boy. He never became the man his tutors prepared him to be. And perhaps in that unfinished story lies England's strange mercy, that sometimes history is shaped not by what was done, but by what never had time to be. History is often remembered for its victories, its crowns and banners, its celebrated heroes. Yet in the reign of Edward VI, a boy who wore the crown too young, who never became a man, we find not triumph but warning. His short life wasted by illness and hardened by ideology reminds us that the lessons of history are often found in its shadows, not its glories. The first lesson is about power and innocence. Edward was still a child when the crown was placed upon his brow. Children are meant to learn empathy through play, through friendship, through mistakes that cost nothing more than scraped knees. Edward never had that chance. His childhood was traded for scripture and politics. The lesson for us is simple but urgent. When a society demands that its children carry the weight of its salvation, it risks raising rulers who can command, but never understand, who can punish, but never forgive. The second lesson is about education. Edward's tutors gave him brilliance without balance. They sharpened his mind until it could argue with scholars, but they left his heart untouched. Knowledge without compassion can be as dangerous as ignorance. We see this not only in monarchs but in ourselves. When we elevate ideology above empathy, we risk creating worlds where human beings are reduced to propositions, statistics, or enemies. True learning must always carry the weight of humanity, or else it becomes a tool for cruelty. The third lesson lies in the spectacle of power. Tudor justice was theatre designed to instruct through fear. Edward learned that lesson too well. He discovered that fear bends faster than persuasion, and he applied it relentlessly. Today we must ask ourselves how often fear is still used as a tool of control in politics, in workplaces, even in families. Fear may command obedience, but it never wins loyalty. The past reminds us that systems built on fear collapse the moment the hand directing them falters. A fourth lesson comes from Edward's decline. As his body wasted, his will hardened. Pain did not soften him. It made him more determined, more ruthless. Suffering can teach compassion, but it can also deepen cruelty if the sufferer clings to anger instead of humility. Each of us faces hardship. The question history presses upon us is, will our pain open us to others, or will it close us further into ourselves? Finally, Edward's story reminds us that sometimes mercy comes in strange forms. England was spared his adult rule because his body failed. History turned because of frailty, not strength. We often imagine that only great victories shape the world, but sometimes it is the accidents, an illness, a weakness, a premature ending that change the course of nations. The lesson is humility. None of us commands time. Our influence rests not in how long we live, but in what kind of humanity we cultivate while we are here. The Boy King's reign is a mirror. It shows us what happens when power outruns compassion, when ideology eclipses mercy, when childhood is sacrificed on the altar of politics. Its lesson is not confined to Tudor England. It belongs to every age that risks forgetting that the first duty of power, whether in kings, in governments, or in us, is not control, but care. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.